Very much, Jotham. So we've got four very provocative papers to think about, and at this point we'd like to open it up to the audience. And the idea, as I said, is we'll take 4 or 5 questions at a time, and then everybody can kind of reflect on them collectively, and then we'll do that again. So, any questions or comments?
If you could raise your hand, we'll pass the mics.
Yes. One question we'll do, of course, as well. Down here.
I'm starting off with a contingent of people who've just peeked at Piketty. Does it work? Yeah. Okay. Yeah, I just wanted to follow up on Venus's third question there about globalization and inequality, and maybe it also links to the question about reception in the U.S. and Europe. And particularly with the notion, all the discussion of global sustainability and resources and ecology and so on, and the clash between that and, you know, a global consumer society with, you know, the impossibility of our current consumption standards of the upper, you know, quintiles being sort of unsustainable globally. Does Piketty sort of have any implications for that whole debate or discussion?
Might as well answer while the mic's getting flipped around. But no, Piketty is strangely silent on questions of environment and ecology and resources, which seems odd for a book written about growth in 2015. Julia wants to add something?
Yeah, I would perhaps qualify that statement a little bit. You're right, this is not a topic, very urgent topics of environmentalism, ecology, sustainability. These are not topics that he goes into at length. However, I would suggest that there are very important statements, short, in the books and also in some of the interviews, you know, the ongoing reception of the book and including his own participation, in which he makes very striking statements considering the weighty nature of this book and the fact that it is explicitly about economics, economic history, political economy. He has said these are mere technicalities. We need to straighten out the problems of income inequality and thus access to political power and so on and so forth, so that we can deal with the really important issues, which are precisely issues of sustainability, environmentalism, and ecology. So those statements are not elaborate, however, I would not disregard them either, particularly because Piketty comes from the French context.
And also, if I could add one more thing, it's just that, as Rachel brought out, one of the things that he's sort of trying to do in this book is to explicate an alternative to relying on high economic growth to bail us out of the problems of inequality that we're facing. And of course, the ecological constraints are part of why you would want to do that.
Okay.
Yes, I tried to have, reading this book, I had a real difficult time getting his attitude, a fix on economic growth and its relationship to inequality, because it's based on this formula, R is greater than G, right? The return on capital tends to be greater than economic growth, which would suggest that if we have more economic growth, then there ought to be a greater return to those who do not own capital. On the other hand, at times he writes as if it would be better if we had less economic growth, in the sense that there would be thereby less inequality. So which position does he wind up ultimately taking in this book? Is a pro-growth agenda in the end going to be better or worse for us?
I think he's basically saying, if we think that growth is going to be the answer, we're just, you know, that's just not going to work, right? And so if we can't take that as an assumption, or is that's a solution. I think his crucial thing is, you know, is pointing out that as capital accumulates, right, capital is elastic enough that it's just going to continue to go toward the capital income. Income is going to be swayed more toward income from capital rather than income from labor, and that's
that's a problem, but we just can't get out of it by expecting that growth is going to be the answer. We have to look to policy, and I think democracy is not only the thing we're trying to protect, but also the way that we're going to get there as well. So I think that's a crucial part of his argument.
If I could just perhaps add on to that statement, I think one of the things I found really particularly refreshing about reading Piketty was what I felt to be a kind of unwillingness to fall into those kinds of binaries and oppositions between only two alternatives. And I felt that this came through repeatedly in his discussions of possible solutions, for instance, in his acknowledgement or construction of the way economic decisions are made by individuals. We are to a degree constrained by our circumstances, and yet we are also agents with will, and so on and so forth. So I felt that there was something very realistic and again, refreshing about the complexity of his views, which I think does not contradict, on the contrary,
no,
what you just said.
Absolutely. He doesn't have like a number of growth or a kind of how what the level of taxation does. He repeatedly emphasizes that, in fact, will come out through democratic processes.
Yeah, and so his use of the word, what is he investigating? Over time, he's investigating the dynamic of the relationships of these different factors, and I think one wants an answer to that question, perhaps, but it's not clear that, to me, that he thinks that there is a simple answer. Right.
I guess one other thing that I might say about this, and he's not, and this is something he's been criticized for. First of all, that this relationship R is greater than G, he says very explicitly, is an empirical observation. It's not theorized. He doesn't specifically know why it's the case. But it seems to me that the way he understands these, he sees G as largely exogenous. Right? It's something we don't really understand and can't really control. Whereas the return on capital, I think he sees essentially as a social fact. It's simply how we as a society choose to divide up the economic product. So in a sense, I think, to a large extent, I think he thinks that since we don't understand, we can't control G, so R is what we have to work with. And whether it's that we change it by taxation or by redistribution or some other mechanism.
And they're basically separate.
Yeah, they're not particularly linked.
Yeah. But surely we can do something about growth. I mean, that's the whole point of fiscal policy, isn't it? Well, to try to encourage growth at certain points.
Yeah, I mean, economists argue about this endlessly.
Well, they argue about what will do it, but it can hardly be a completely exogenous factor as in terms of wealth.
But I'm not sure that that I get the message from reading the book that promoting growth would be the ultimate end of economic and, I'm going to say, social policy as well. Perhaps the ultimate end would be something more like reasonable distribution. That's not the same thing necessarily. It's not always exclusive either.
Yeah, if I could jump in there just very quickly, I just read the book to prepare for the panel, and he argues, based on some historical examples, that actually fiscal policy makes very little difference. And so he juxtaposes different historical cases where they pursued very different policies and shows that they actually had the same results.
Yeah.
So it kind of fits with what Jotham was saying, that he views it as something that we largely can't control.
Yeah, and maybe just to follow up on a couple of the last questions and comments, I certainly think it's a really fair point that he's not focusing on institutions and particularly international financial institutions. However, he's also at the same time remaining true to the data sets that he has. In other words, those actually don't provide all that much explanation of the so-called exogenous factors and all these things that are going into these transformations. Venus, you're mentioning that's such an interesting timeline of talking about the transformation of the discussion of economic growth appearing in the 1930s, popularized in the 1950s, and now ubiquitous. Well, of course, the term development has almost exactly the same timeline, and it's works like Gilbert Rist's work on the history of development as a sociologist who's also interested in these institutions I don't think the data that he uses, the big data that he uses, can ever really get at these really important, crucial factors. On the other hand, it does provide, exactly, Julia, as you're saying, a way of understanding the big picture. In other words, if we fault him for not having a subtle understanding, or at least a subtle explanation of these sort of institutional factors going into inequality, if he had provided that, we would be left with the question, well, what does that have to do with your data? Because I'm not sure that understanding capital income ratios explains the IMF, in any way.
That's a good point. Yeah.
And one of the things that really struck me, because one of the major benefits that he thinks would come out of this kind of international capital tax is precisely data, that it would provide transparency about the wealth and the distribution of wealth. And the thing that really struck me about that is this is the exact same argument Monchrétien was making exactly 500 years ago, except now it's at an international rather than a national scale.
So just really quickly, so in this reading, is Piketty profoundly anti-Keynesian? Because isn't the exact, impulsive?
Could you use the microphone?
It doesn't actually do anything.
It's for the recording.
Oh, sorry. So in this reading, is Piketty profoundly Keynesian, right? Because if the point here, what we're hearing is like in the long term, political mobilization can't do much about growth. It can do something about redistribution. But isn't Keynes saying that it's very important, not the long term, but the short? It seems.
Well, I think maybe I would approach the question in a different way, in that Keynes was a consummate politician, but at the end of the day, he really was an economist. And so, he invents monetary policy and really believes that monetary policy can promote growth. But I don't think Piketty would say that, right? I think we've just said that he doesn't really think that you can control growth. And Keynes built an entire career on the idea that you could, right, if you had the right tools. So I think it's less a question about spending or not spending, and more a question of shifting one's attention to politics and away from economics, right? I think that's what makes Piketty so interesting, is that he's an economist who believes that the only real fixes for social problems are political, whereas most economists would say, scrap the politics, the market can fix everything.
Isn't that exactly what Keynes is saying? It's just a different emphasis of politics?
Not. Keynes really believed in the ability of the government to intervene in the market and guide it in the right way.
That's politics.
Yeah.
It is, but it's not. It's not through tax.
It's technocratic politics.
It's technocratic. It's through interest rates. It's through the Fed. It's through,
fiscal policy as well.
Yeah, and Piketty spent a fair amount of time at the MIT economics department, which is like the high citadel of neo-Keynesianism. And so I would assume that he has some affinity towards that. I think there's one technical thing that's going on here, which is that at least one of, I'm not a technical economist, but my understanding is that at least one of the big issues between Keynesians and non-Keynesians is whether equilibrium models work on short time scales. And Keynes thinks they don't, and that's why you need the technocratic intervention. But Piketty is operating in that long run in which we are all dead. So to him, that dispute, the answer to that dispute doesn't matter if you're looking at time scales of 200 years. Whether you return to equilibrium within 1 year or whether you return to equilibrium within 50 years, doesn't really matter.
Can I just interject one last thing?
Yeah, of course.
Then perhaps what this means is that Piketty has a much more profound implications for the possibilities of the left. Is this a reintroduction of sort of an economic determinism through the back door in a certain way? That this is a way of saying, like, look, over the last 40 years, last 50 years, we actually thought that we had a lot more control over our fate than we do, which seems to be a profound impulse of social democracy. And it seems like this is much more profound and important than, the open-collared, relaxed presentation of Piketty would have us think, no?
Well, I think he wants us to move the emphasis of control, right? So that for Keynes, or any other economist for that matter, orthodox economist, the real issues are production and consumption, right? Keynes is thinking in terms of how to spur consumption by disincentivizing savings and creating job growth through investment, right? Whereas for Piketty, the real category is distribution, right? If you look at all of those three things as the way that an economy works, traditionally economists don't think much about distribution, right? And I think that for Piketty, that is in fact the only thing that you can control, really, right? You can control that through taxation or other mechanisms for redistributing wealth, but consumption and production are much more difficult to control, right? That's happening at an individual level.
Dan Smale, one of the things that really strikes me about this excellent panel is, although I read the book, I haven't had time to keep up with the discussions and debates about it. It's been really helpful hearing how it's being received critically, positively. My question is going to sound a bit naive, in part because I haven't kept up with these discussions. I wanted to come back to the R is greater than G, because it's a really powerful concept, and it leads almost to this idea that people get wealthy without really even trying to do it, which on the one hand, there's something attractive about that idea. It's sort of like an invisible hand that is leading in the wrong direction, rather not towards a self-regulating society, but one that is becoming wildly unself-regulating and creating these economic disparities. So that I can see there's a certain attraction to it, but as I was reading it, I kept thinking that but this really implies that people aren't going out and hunting for it. And this is where I wanted to find out what's being said about it. So the reason I say this, let me give you a couple of examples. One of them is serious, one of them is frivolous. The serious one is that there have been studies, or at least a study that I know of, that is shown that when students take an Economics 101 class, they come into the class with an instinct towards charity that is almost entirely abolished by the time they take the survey at the end of the class, when they decide to be selfish. In other words, there are things that are working in our society that are telling people that it's good to accumulate. So this implies something other than an R versus G that might be explaining why we're getting vast economic inequality. So my frivolous comment, and it just comes from the fact that I've been interested in compulsive hoarding lately, is that the latest trend, I mean, there's a lot of work done on compulsive hoarding in the last, over the last 2, 3, 4 decades, and it's entered the DSM in the last 3, 4 years or whatever. How do we know that we're not just dealing with compulsive hoarders who are just hoarding a different kind of object?
Well, to address a little bit your question, I mean, it seems to me, I mean, one side of this is not just the accumulation of wealth, but also the accumulation of income, or the rise in income and the rising disparity in income, right? The super wealthy, CEOs, C-suite wages. That does absolutely seem to be a cultural phenomenon, right? And rather than rooted in any kind of actual reward for performance or anything like that. So I think that's true. On a personal note, you can't help but read the book and think, now where am I? You do. I can see how that can be part of it, but then at the same time, you come out thinking, you're angry. So.
Yeah. To think a little bit more about that very interesting question, I wonder if I might ask you, before I try to add an additional response, the study that you cite about how the attitudes of economic students change, was that a study that was based in American universities?
Yeah, I think it's coming out of behavioral economics. So Kahneman is what I read about it, yeah.
Okay. So the students who were interviewed or surveyed were in fact American students in American universities. I would want to suggest that the issue of culture here is extremely important, and there's some interesting work coming from sociology, Michel Lamont's work on money and morality, contrasting attitudes toward money and values, and in the case of Americans and in the case of French people is interesting and notable. It's also interesting to think about the kinds of terms that are used in discussions of finance and economics. One thing that you hear in France that I don't think you hear as much of in the United States at this time is to couple together the terms ethics and finance, for instance. When I work with visiting lecturers from the Clermont-Ferrand École de Management who come every year to my university, these are the kinds of topics that they are capable of talking about. I am afraid that I don't hear the same kind of discussion coming from the students in the very excellent business school at my university. And going back to Tocqueville, if you think about, and you know, I'm going to spit out some horrible generalizations, but if you think about national character, national history, national mentalities, if these things exist to any degree, the values of autonomy, the creation of the self, the idea, it's now something of a fiction, as economic studies have shown recently, of social mobility and so on, are so extremely strong in the United States. And these values exist to a certain degree in France, but there are other mitigating values, social harmony, moderation, this kind of Republican egalitarianism that Piketty seems to participate in as well. And the fact that the debate in France can include the conjuncture of something like ethics and finance perhaps speaks to values, but also maybe the evolution of the debate as well. That's not the only area in which ethics, for instance, is present. The food system is another one from my previous work. So that may do something to explain. It's not just something in the current era, it's something in the particular context that promotes these kinds of values, the adoption of these kinds of values. It brings up a very interesting question about education, going back to the talk that François Cusset gave the other day. What is it that we're teaching? Could American classes be taught differently so that the value of charity, for instance, or altruism, whatever you want to call it, is strengthened rather than weakened and reduced and sort of pushed away as an evolutionary liability in American students or any others?
I don't know. If I'm talking about compulsive hoarding, I think that actually brings up a really, really important issue in the history of economic thought, because one of the classic, maybe the classic explanation of capitalism is Max Weber's, right? Which the spirit of capitalism is the spirit of this worldly asceticism. It's the spirit of foregoing consumption, foregoing pleasure for a purely abstract form of accumulation, which is essentially a form of compulsive hoarding. But one of the things that Piketty points out, and I think this is not particularly original to him, I think this is something that is more general among contemporary economic theorists, is that you really don't need to choose. That the structure of capital accumulation, the way he sets it up, is that you very easily get to the point where whatever consumption you can possibly manage is a rounding error in your return on capital. So that he thinks that those things are not fundamentally influenced by culture. That there's kind of brute mathematics that, at least in some aspects of that, kind of no amount of cultural change, at least sort of the kind of cultural change that somebody like Weber would think about, between an emphasis on say consumption versus saving. It's just not going to have any influence on it, because you're talking about $1 million out of $120 million, right, in annual revenue.
Not sure who has the mic now, but is there another question?
Oh, go ahead. Are you sure? Because mine's kind of a weird one. I know. Well, I was thinking now Dan has opened the door with compulsive hoarding off the walkway. So in the list of people with whom Piketty has worked, or whose work foreshadows his own, one person who was not mentioned is Gilles Postel-Vinet and his team of co-authors who really pioneered, in a way, I think, the use of sources that Piketty is drawing on to talk about the growth of inequality. And their work, I think, establishes for the 18th century, or at least establishes that the inequality of the 18th century is nothing compared to the late 19th century inequality, and then again, what we are approaching now in the beginning of the 21st century. And so the off-the-sort-of-wall question in terms of the longue durée is for, and this is maybe for Jotham, for historians of the old regime and of the 18th century, and dare I say the revolution, knowing, you know, we always think when we teach the Ancien Régime, we teach it as a vastly unequal society, as a society structured on inequality in which there were these vast inequalities. But in fact, what this data seems to show is that the inequality, although legally obviously was much more, economically was less, in fact, than in the late 19th century. And I just sort of, I've always wondered how knowing that might affect how we think about the Ancien Régime and the revolution and what followed after that.
It's a really, really interesting question. One thing, of course, is that before the 18th century, it's really, really hard to come up with any data that will let us measure these things. So it's a bit hard to make broad conclusions about the whole Ancien Régime from Impôts Dervinés data and things like that. Because it's possible that the 18th century was more equal than earlier periods. Among other things, this was a period of relatively, the later 18th century was a period of relatively high demographic and economic growth, so that may, according to some of the mechanisms Piketty discusses, have compressed inequality some. But then the other thing, of course, is that the very rapid economic growth you get in the 19th and particularly the 20th century, it simply raises the possible bound. There's a headroom issue, right? And there's only so low that there's a zero lower bound on wealth, and there's only so low that income can go before you can't reproduce your own labor force. As the possibility, as the maximum possible wealth or income increases, as the total economy increases, there's simply more headroom for greater economic inequality. And it's not clear to me sort of what the correct measure is here, whether you want to measure the total inequality or whether you want to sort of somehow adjust it according to how close it is to the maximum possible inequality under that particular economic system.
Yeah, I was just, and this perhaps just reflects my relative ignorance of the topic. I haven't read Piketty's book yet. But to what extent could you say that his book either suggests or reflects a revision of 20th century French economic history? There used to be this story of the sort of Malthusian behavior of French entrepreneurs in the interwar period, and that this was kind of collapsed, or it was changed in the post-war period by Monet's efforts and by the American productivity missions and so on, encouraging more entrepreneurial France. And yet he's saying that really actually the tendency of capitalists is towards seeking rent, and the entrepreneurship is really a secondary issue, you might say. At least that's what I'm getting out of you. And whether that reflects a kind of new understanding of what happened during the Trente Glorieuses. It wasn't about really changing the behavior of the capitalists, but rather these kind of one-off opportunities, like the movement of large parts of the rural population from unproductive agriculture into more productive sectors of the economy, or the Ketchup of, this is the sort of stuff that Barry Eichengreen talks about in his history of post-war European economy, the sort of Ketchup of technological innovation that had been developed over the past 20, 30 years, but hadn't been actually adopted because of the World War and so on. So these were all one-off sort of opportunities, and it had nothing to do with changes in entrepreneurship, and rather, so that's what's really happening in the Trente Glorieuses. And really, France is, we continue with this same story of rent-seeking that had always been the case, and that Piketty is either reflecting a sort of rethinking of that history, or suggests one for us to consider.
I suppose that's the 20th centuryist. I should respond, but I would say. So you've not read the book, but you did use the term catch-up, which is a term that Piketty himself uses, and so he says in the book that these high periods of growth that are anomalous are confined to moments in which countries, classes are catching up. So you're correct in your intuition there. That is exactly what he's saying. Whether or not that moment was preceded by a conservative business world is not something that Piketty himself really takes up. I could be mistaken about that.
Well, he doesn't talk about the interwar
Rachel's on her edge.
No. I mean, it seems to me he doesn't discuss like what's going on. You know, in the interwar period for him, it's like 1914 to 1945 is like a chunk of destruction.
It's a black box.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah, and then the belly pock is another black box.
Yeah.
Yeah. So that's a more minute level of detail that historians will have to take up. Piketty's not doing that work for you.
But I think he does. I think he definitely does imply that, say, national differences in institutional structure and culture make less difference than you might think.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, for sure.
You know, he has that, when he has that discussion of the Trente Glorieuses, or the post-war period, comparing Germany and France and others, so that the French subheading is "Capitalism without capitalists." You know, is this section, you know, where he's discussing how small and medium enterprises were left to their own devices, but everything else is nationalized. In other words, big industry and so on. And so in that sense, sort of the entrepreneurial spirit arguably is not actually interrupted by that. You know, depending on how you define, you know, entrepreneurial spirit, certainly in the case of the United States right now, there are far fewer small and medium enterprises comparatively between in the United States today compared to many European countries. But I just wanted to return to something, Joe, something you were saying earlier, which makes me now wonder about thinking about Adam Smith a little bit, where, so, you know, given that there's a minimum, you know, short of genocide, I mean, there's a minimum amount. Exactly. But in a way, we're turning back to equilibrium, right? And you know, when Smith talks about equilibrium, he's discussing it in a period of low growth. And he gives a few geographic, you know, he talks about the rentier class, he talks about this new commercial class and the workers. And he plays out these scenarios, again, in different geographies, just like Piketty does. He talks about Europe and how Europe is so awry because of colonialism, talks about America and its cheap land. But then the place where equilibrium is best achieved is China.
Yep, which it always is all through the 18th century.
Exactly.
The physiocrats are just insane about China.
Yeah, exactly. And so I wonder, actually, how much his 21st century looks like Adam Smith's 18th century China. In other words, a perfect equilibrium is actually achieved in Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations, but it's Qing dynasty China, not the United States, or the proto-United States.
Yeah, no, I think you're exactly right. And I think that he's, in some ways, he is carrying on this tradition of political economic thought from the 18th century that thought in terms of the equilibrium of an agrarian society.
But it's also...
Maybe we're going back to that.
Well, I was just going to add that I think the discussion that Smith is engaged in, and then the discussion that Mill and Ricardo take up after Smith, is framed by a very different set of questions, right? And so the stationary state, I think, is something quite different than what Piketty is describing. And even Piketty says himself, 1% per year as a growth rate might not sound terribly impressive, but when you think about that over the course of a generation, it starts to compound pretty quickly. So that I don't think that what he's pointing at is any kind of equilibrium or stationary state. It's just low growth.
1% per year is still, depending on who you believe, anywhere from double to probably 10 times the normal rate of growth in the pre-industrial world. So.
There's a question over there.
Yeah, your panel really focused on what was on Piketty in historical perspective, and you spent a lot of time, we spent a lot of time discussing how Piketty may or may not challenge current narratives of economic growth and development, and also what the implications of his study are for policy. But I think another question that we might think about is, what can Piketty teach historians? And when I think about that, my answer is gathering data, which is something that historians no longer do. And he's got an amazing amount of data. It's powerful. Data is incredibly powerful, right? And there's a whole sector of the historical profession that no longer believes in data. It's problematic. And what Piketty really shows, I mean, the economists were excited because here was somebody who gathered, and not all alone, with a whole team of people, a lot of really historical data going back far in time and across numerous countries, which is an incredible job. But I think what Piketty shows for historians is if you want to answer in certain kinds of fields, not in everything, if you want to answer big questions, data can be very, very powerful. And there's a point where sometimes we're writing ourselves away from dealing with big questions in this profession because of the reticence, the move away from data, which I think has gone too far in history. And it takes an economist, right, who's really trained as a historian too. But it really takes an economist to bring us, and there's a whole set of economists in Piketty's mold, to sort of remind us of the fact that data really matters, and data can really, it takes a tremendous amount of energy and money to gather it, but can really help us answer crucial historical questions.
Hoffman makes a similar point in the Salon. Who himself gathered great data for growth in a
traditional society. People are really in a
society.
minority.
They are.
I certainly wouldn't quarrel with that globally, but one thing that is worth pointing out, and again going back to what he wants out of his capital tax, for example, the data that he has overwhelmingly comes from the modern, roughly post-revolutionary state, and that doesn't mean that this form of data gathering is useless for earlier periods, but it's far, far more constrained for earlier periods.
What I would add to your comment, Laird, is that it's data, and it's so great that he has it all online. If you dig into it, I mean, it's wonderful. I've downloaded this stuff. I'm trying to use it in all my ways too. 5:30. But also his verve about writing about it and his claiming that he can make these big questions, and answer these big questions. That's what I found so invigorating.
It's interesting too, because he actually criticizes economists for not being interested in data.
Yeah. Is this?
Yes.
Okay. Thank you. Just a few comments. I'm sort of a few steps behind the conversation, so I'm going to sort of make a few comments. First, to Dan on hoarding, that was a really interesting comment, and sort of to me, it struck me. Well, it depends what you're hoarding, right? I mean, there's hoarding of consumer goods and things, material objects, and that's sort of what the people studying hoarding seem to be studying, versus hoarding assets, which is a very different sort of thing to hoard, and there are implications for economic implications, cultural implications, et cetera, for hoarding these different kinds of things. And there are different people hoarding different ones, I think. But just to sort of complicate the hoarding question. And then to Claire's point, yeah, this 19th, 18th century distinction is a tough one. I think you're right, Jotham, that it's hard to compare because the level of assets, financial assets, there's so much higher in the late 19th century. Of course, there's going to be a tremendous amount more of inequality. So it doesn't. I still think you can make a good case for a lot of nasty inequality in the 18th century, regardless of what they're saying, over the long term. And in fact, I mean, one thing I liked about Piketty, and I use actually in class because it reinforces what I was teaching anyway, is that for the 18th century, especially the second half, there appears to be mobility in both directions. There's upward mobility, increasing upward mobility, and increasing downward mobility. And this is happening under conditions of overall growth, which is exactly the kind of thing that Piketty is suggesting is part of, the last couple hundred years of history. So for me, it helped reinforce what I teach in the classroom in that respect. And then finally, I have to say something about the Piketty and Smith and the physiocrats, which is intriguing. One thing that's interesting about Smith that I found is that, and this is where I think he might actually compare to Piketty in some ways, is that even though Smith wants to dismantle, obviously, the mercantilism, the mercantile system that is state regulation of trade and all the rest of it, he still believes that, unlike the physiocrats, even if you didn't dismantle it, there's going to be growth. We're going to be okay. This will work out. That is, the economy impels itself, despite the fact that the British government is clearly screwing everything up with these mercantile regulations. And physiocrats And here Smith is very clear that this is really where he departs from the physiocrats, besides the usual places that we all know, because physiocrats think that this is disaster, right? Tinkering with the economy in any way, messing with their definition of private property and all the rest, in any way, will just completely torpedo the economy. And so, in that sense, Piketty's sense of this sort of mass movement you can't get away from is more Smithy in a strange sort of way. Even though I did find your attempt to bring his French legacy into relief really very interesting. I think you're right about that. But the physiocrats is a little different, I think.
Yeah.
Michael, can I add one small point to that?
Please, yeah.
In addition, it's interesting to complicate it by throwing in Vincent de Gournay, because Vincent de Gournay, in fact, worried about capital becoming too accumulated and thought that the main role the government may have to maintain is to keep capital circulating.
Yeah, some of the early 17th century political economists had that same worry. I mean, Montchrétien worried about that too.
Well, into circulation.
Yeah.
If I may respond to Laird's question, to come back to what can we learn from Piketty, I think he asked us to cast a new eye on the late 19th century and the early 20th century. I mean, to him, that looms so large, and in a way that even though I've spent a lot of time thinking about that period, did not realize just how divergent the classes were. And so I think that we should go back there.